Good evening and a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us at this Tuesday night learning session at the Sklar. My name is Cheryl Shushat, and I'm a proud member of Congregation Shar HaShemayim. Permit me a short preamble before I introduce our distinguished guests tonight. The first question that comes to mind when discussing the subject of Jewish solidarity during the Holocaust is how? Surrounded by humiliation, hardship, and loss, how is it possible for people to stay human and show compassion and empathy towards other human beings? One of the most inspiring stories of Jewish solidarity is the story of the Bielski brothers. In 1941, following a massacre in their town, Stankiewicz, the Bielski brothers fled and set up a camp deep in the Belarus forest. They eventually rescued 1,200 men, women, and children, doing everything they could against all odds to save Jewish lives. There are now over 25,000 descendants worldwide of this resilient group of people. The 2008 movie Defiance was based on the story of the Bielski partisan. On a more specific personal note, the town of Novogrodic in Belarus was the home of more than 6,500 Jews before the Nazis invaded in 1941. The last remaining 250 Jews of the town, including Hannah and Sholem Ryback, engineered an incredible escape through a 208-meter-long tunnel so they could join the Free Jews of the Bielski Brigade hiding out in the nearby forest. 3 generations of Hannah and Sholem Ryback will now present first-hand accounts of this couple's escape through that tunnel, and they're joining the Bielski partisans. We are so honored to have with us tonight Hannah and Sholem Ryback's daughter, Sylvia Sklar, and the granddaughter, Alissa Sklar, and great-granddaughter, Maya Hillcoat. Just a brief introduction about our speakers. Sylvia Sklar was born in a displaced persons camp. At McGill University, Sylvia was the coordinator of professional learning, the McGill Office of Leadership in Community and International Initiatives, and assistant professor in the Department of Education. Sylvia is a member of the Montreal Voices of Holocaust Descendants Executive. Dr. Alissa Sklar is the VP of Marketing for GIS Planning, a service from the Financial Times, as well as an educational consultant on children and digital technology. Maya Hillcoat is an art student at Dawson College. Maya graduated with first-class standing and honors from Trafalgar School for Girls. And I understand that this presentation was inspired by their participation in the Bielski Brigade 75th Descendants Reunion in Belarus in 2019. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Cheryl. I appreciate just want to make sure that you're seeing my screen, actually. I'm not sure that you are. Maya, are you able to see that? Let's bring that up. Okay. So I really, there you go. You should be able to see it now. Is that better? Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate that very much. We're very excited to be here. This is very meaningful to us. I should add that Maya is also a graduate of Akiva, so we've spent a lot of time in the Shar Shemaim synagogue over the years, and we're delighted to be here. This presentation is going to be going back and forth between the three of us, and so with that, I'm just going to get it started, and you'll see that all three of us at different times are actually going to be speaking. And we're happy to share the screen deck. If anyone wants, they can get in touch with Robin after the fact, and I'm happy to share the link to this online. So Mom, I'll hand this over to you to give our dedication today.
So I too am a proud member of Congregation Shar Shemaim, and thank you for this opportunity. I would like to dedicate our presentation tonight to Tamara Vershitskaya, founder and director of the Jewish Resistance Museum in Novogrodok. That is her picture. She has devoted her life to commemorating our families who participated in the courageous escape from the labor camp by tunnel. The museum is located on the actual site of that labor camp that we will talk about tonight. Because of Tamara's efforts to uncover the history and location of this secret tunnel, we now have this memorial wall which honors each of the 240 people who took part on the escape. The names of my mother, Chana Iwinietka Rybak, and my father, Shlomo Rybak, appear on this wall. This amazing woman also enabled the research and development of the site of the Bielski partisan camp in the forest that is vital to these previously unknown stories of Jewish resistance during the war. Many of you know about the recent protests in Belarus. The coverage of the protests are no longer highlighted on the news because journalists have had their equipment smashed and many were badly beaten before being imprisoned. Tamara unwittingly has been caught up in this craziness. After a group of protesters came to visit the museum, she was taken to prison and informed that her contract will not be renewed. There is no curator who will take her place after April 2nd, which means effectively that the museum will be closing. We are concerned as other museum directors in the area have been fired. Some have disappeared and others have been fined or imprisoned. She is in our hearts as we share our story with you. May Hashem bless Tamara and keep her safe.
This is not my great uncle Ephraim Rybak, and I'm showing you this picture, which is really my uncle Jamie as a toddler, because there are no images of Ephraim who died around this age. There's no birth certificate or death certificate, and there's no proof at all that he ever really lived. We're here to tell his story so he's not forgotten, along with the stories of his parents, my great-grandparents, Chana and Shlomo Rybak, and the many others who were part of the tunnel escape and resistance. So hi, my name is Maya Hillcoat, and I'm a third-generation descendant of Holocaust survivors. And I heard some of these stories growing up about my great-grandparents, but it always seemed really far away, like something that I'd learned in a history book that didn't really impact my life now. Working on this project has made it feel a lot more real and a lot more relevant to me today. I'm a first-year student at Dawson in liberal arts, and last spring I was supposed to go on the March of the Living trip to Poland and to Israel, which was unfortunately canceled due to the pandemic. But I'm proud to help keep these stories alive now. So next up will be my mom, Alissa Sklar, who's a second-generation descendant, and she also grew up hearing some of these stories, but she got to hear some of them from her grandparents themselves.
Thank you, Maya. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by my daughter. I was very close to my grandparents growing up as the oldest grandchild in the family, and I really knew only very vague outlines of their escape and their time with the partisans. They didn't like to talk about it very much, but I knew that my grandfather could make almost anything out of a wire hanger and a stick. He carved walking sticks out of tree branches for all of his grandchildren. Nothing in their home was ever wasted. He used every single apple on the tree in the backyard, and he loved spending time with us up north at our house in the Laurentians. He showed me every berry and nut and growing thing that you could possibly eat, and he loved to fish in the lake and made gefilte fish out of the fish that he pulled from that lake, which was certainly memorable. It was really in the summer of 2019 when I went back with my mom, my uncle Jaime, and a couple of my cousins to Belarus, to Minsk, for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the forest camp. So that would have been July 1944. The story really came to life. Suddenly it wasn't history. Suddenly these were the trees. This was the forest. This was the ghetto. Here was the tunnel. And it really made the difference between story and history and made these things really relevant to me. And we were there to bear witness to these two unique acts of resistance and defiance that led to the survival of so many Jews. And for the 1,200 men, women, and children that survived because of the Bielskis at the end of the war. It's estimated there are now over 25,000 descendants worldwide, some of which we've had the privilege of meeting online and at that reunion as well. And gives me my pleasure to introduce my mom as well, Sylvia.
So my twin brother, Jaime, and I have good memories of growing up in the 1950s in Montreal. Yet I remember the deep and palpable sadness that would just permeate throughout our house during the high holidays. Our energetic parents, who are always so busy building our new lives, would suddenly become very quiet and sad. Somehow, we as little kids knew that we had to be extra good at these times. As children, we were protected from the stories about the war, but we heard conversations with other Greene about the forest, about the lager, the labor camp, and the ghetto. On Sunday afternoons, we would walk Park Avenue from St. Viator to Mount Royal in the hope of meeting other survivors from other towns in the area. And the parents would gather in clusters and talk about, do you know what happened with so-and-so from Peranovich? And what happened with so-and-so from Bialystok? As children, it didn't mean a whole lot to us. And the parents didn't talk directly to us about these stories. We met Tuvia Bielski when he came to bar mitzvahs and weddings, and he tried to come to everything possible that celebrated the survivors. But in our eyes, he was a very ordinary looking man who drove a taxi in New York City. I just going to give you a little bit of a context before the war that became very clear to us after the reunion. There was a very strong Jewish community in Novogrudok, very much like that of Montreal. And that is where our story began. Chana was born there in 1914. She studied nursing in Vilna. My dad was born in Radin. Remembers as a kid the Chafetz Chaim coming to his house and asking him a question, and my father answering the question, and the Chafetz Chaim kissed him on his forehead. He never forgot the magical moment. He studied education in Vilna and got a job as a teacher in Novogrudok. And eventually he became the principal of the school, the Tashia school, Jewish school in Novogrudok. He met my mother, and they got married December 31st, 1939, when the ominous sounds of war were approaching. Before the war, the population of Belarus was 63% Jewish. Yiddish, Polish, and Russian were the three official languages. Novogrudok, known as Novardok in modern Belarus, was a wonderful place for these young people to grow up before the war.
So just to give you a map to situate where we actually are in the world. So Novogrudok, you can see the white arrow is pointing to it. This is a crossroads of history. Different times it was Poland, it was Russia, it was, Lithuania crossed all the time. And what happened is that we had the Soviet occupation, of course, at that time, and there was this Russian occupation. So we have a line that was drawn down between what is now Belarus and Poland. And you can see as a result of the von Ribbentrop Pact that the people of Novogrudek were actually protected briefly from the Nazis who were invading and pushing eastward. And what happened was that you had refugees from Poland, from all of those other places to the west of that line, pouring into Belarus, trying to seek escape from the Nazis. So you had this kind of swelling of the Jewish population in that area. But of course, that didn't last for very long. The war eventually came to Novogrudek, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, Mom, maybe you want to just talk briefly to some of the pictures and talk about what life was like.
So this is a picture of a little girl who kind of is an image of the wonderful life in Novogrudek. She is wearing a Purim costume. Her name is Michaela, and there is a statue in her honor on the grounds of the Museum of Jewish Resistance. The Purim celebration was celebrated not unlike the wonderful Purim spiel that the congregation of Shar Shemayim put on just a few days ago. But their Polish neighbors celebrated with the Jews in the area. Life was very good. Here are pictures of children growing up. They had theater, they went to schools, they belonged to Jewish organizations, they're well-dressed, very much like your grandchildren, your children that you see today. Here's a picture of the world-famous Mir Yeshiva, the original Mir Yeshiva. There's a branch still existing in Manhattan. People came from all over. Some even came from South Africa, I believe, to attend the famous Mir Yeshiva. Right now, it is a post office. Jews-owned pharmacies, hotels, photo studios. There was a cinema, a casino. There was concert halls, the public library. There were 2 newspapers. The 6,500 Jews of Novogrudek made up 64% of the total population. Here's some just to very quickly take you through to the very few photos that remain of my family. My father came from a family of 4 children. He's the only survivor. These are the only existing pictures that I have seen of his family. On your left are my mom and dad in the days before the war. They're friends. The man is wearing a costume. He was in the Polish army. You want to go on to the next photo? No, here's a picture of my dad and his friends going biking in Rodden. And I just love this wonderful picture where they're all dressed up with tie and shirts to go biking. Life was good. Here's a high school outing. Mom is in the front row on the right. The gymnasium went out for picnics, and they really had very fond pre-war memories of the good life in Novogrudek.
So one of the things that we learned when we were there in Belarus is there's actually a surprisingly small amount of anti-Semitism in this particular area around Minsk and Belarus, unlike other places of the former Eastern Europe. And in fact, one of the things that we learned in the museum was that a lot of the escape from the ghetto and the Bielski partisans largely were able to happen in this context because they had reasonably good relationship with the Poles and Tatars and fellow Soviet citizens in this era. They depended upon them for being hidden, for supplies. There were all sorts of interesting, this is a picture that we took of some of these folks at the bus stop when we were there. And in fact, at the 75th reunion, there were representatives from the Lukashenko government. This obviously predates the protests that have been in the news in the past year, but unlike other governments in this part of the world, they were happy to support the museum. And they see this as part of this larger narrative of the Great Patriotic War, which is how they call the Second World War.
Alissa, if I may interrupt you, I just recently learned from Tamara that those old guys with all the medals in the front were actually active in the Russian the Russian partisans who were in the Naliboki forest.
That's interesting. Yeah. So one of the things that we learned is there's many different groups of partisans. The Bielski partisans are famous because it was one of the few Jewish groups. There were in fact, other partisan groups as well that were Jewish, but they obviously had relationships with the Russian partisans as well. So everything changed, of course, when the Nazis broke the von Ribbentrop Pact and crossed over the line. June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis invaded this part of the world. And this is actually really significant because the Soviets controlled the news. This came as a complete shock to the residents, including the Jews in this area. They had no advance notice until the tanks and the trucks and the horses broke into their area. And of course, you can imagine the panic when these things happened. And that began this kind of timeline for extermination. And on July 4th, they marched into the town of Novogrudok, which is the site of the museum and the site of the ghetto and the tunnel escape. And Maya is going to read to us a testimonial from one of our cousins who was in the area at the time. This is a picture of the square in Novogrudok that she's going to be telling you about right now.
So this testimony is from our cousin, Rhea Kushner, and she was 16 years old at the time. So one Saturday, the Germans asked the Judenrat to gather 50 nice-looking young girls to work. In spite of their fear, they had to obey. Their mothers were crying, terrified for their daughters, but they had no choice. The Germans took the girls to the town square, where there was music being played by a small orchestra. They had gathered 150 Jewish lawyers, professors, artists, and writers. The soldiers shot them as the music was playing. The blood was running on the stones of the square. We, the 50 girls, were required to wash the blood from the stones. We helped put the dead bodies on a wagon. The heads of the people were hanging off the back of the wagon. We knew these people. The music continued to play as we washed the blood off the stones. The Germans were laughing and dancing in the square. So on this same day, my great-grandmother, Hannah, was home with her family, and her brother, Motto, was one of the men called to the square. She told her family that he put on his suit and combed his hair before he went, and the family watched in horror from their upstairs window, it's the open window on the building right there, as her brother Motto was among the men shot. And this was her house, and that was the window. And the message to the population was quite loud and quite clear. Intimidation, fear, and compliance were all expected and required.
Now, I had heard this story many times about the shooting in the square, but when we went back on the partisan reunion, my brother and I found the house. We had the address, we knew where it was going to be, and we knocked on the door and went upstairs. The house was being renovated. It was going to become some kind of commercial establishment. And we went upstairs and looked through the window and we saw the square. I can never explain the visceral reaction that we had as we watched this view now onto what was a peaceful scene, and imagining the horror of my mother and her family as they watched one of their children being killed. So here's a timeline for extermination that was very systematic, very thought out. As you know, by August 16th, the Jews between 14 and 16 were forced into work groups, and they were given work papers. These work papers were golden because that was the passport to living a little bit longer, as long as you could do something to feed the German machinery. Chana was 28 years old and Shlomo was 27. She got a permit as a nurse, and Shlomo, who was a teacher, didn't have a very valuable saying as a work permit, but got one as a bookkeeper and a cook. Their baby, Ephraim, was a little over a year old. On December 7th, there was a decree that went out in the town that everybody must gather up all their belongings that they could carry, leave their homes, and assemble in this area. Disabled persons, elderly, and families with many young children must gather in the courtyard, and go into the Catholic convent next to the courthouse. That's the building on the right. Another 5,000 people, including those who had certificates of labor, that's everybody, were squeezed into the courtyard between the two courts. It was freezing in the courtyard. The same kind of climate that we have here in Canada, in Montreal. The people spent the night terrified, huddled together for warmth. They were squeezed in so tight they couldn't sit down or get anything out of a suitcase. They were told that they were going to be relocated to the ghetto on Parasika Street. So they spent that night. In the early morning, there was an order saying, we're going to let some of you into the buildings to warm up. That was the next morning, called Black Monday, December 8th. The selection began as people were allowed to go into the building. A wave to the right or the left separated the group. In the first slaughter, or Shrita, about 4,500 people were shot near the village of Skridlevo, where pits had been prepared. So that's out of the population of about 6,500, 4,500 people were shot right away. And all the disabled, the elderly, and the families in the convent were also shot. The survivors, scant 1,500 people, were left to go into the march up that road to the Parasika ghetto. And that's the road. Maya?
So the following is a testimony from Luba Rudnicki from the Navaradok Memorial Book. When the last group of workers returned to the ghetto, it became clear that none of our relatives and friends survived. Everyone was in deep mourning. No one lost their minds. There was no heart attacks. To this day, I cannot understand how we had the drive to survive and where we found the strength to overcome our indescribable losses.
So that takes us to the summer of 1942. And just before I come back and tell you a little bit more about the children's action, I think Maya will describe, this is ultimately after the Parasika ghetto was liquidated. And even at the beginning, before when that ghetto was still there, people were brought to workshops. People who had special skills that were valuable to the Nazis, seamstresses, leather workers, people who could work in munitions factories and make bullets and guns, prepare saddles, uniforms, those kinds of things. So this is, you see this is a model from the museum. You see the courtyard for the courthouse, the big white building on the right. The barracks were the buildings on the left with the yellow roofs, the little ones, and that eventually became the work ghetto that they were eventually moved into. But the workshops where they were forced as literally as slave laborers to work are the red brick buildings in the front, and that's where they ended up working. And Maya's going to tell you a little bit about the children's action.
The following is another testimony from our cousin Rhea Kushner in her book, The Miracle of Life. So 1942, the Germans came at 4 a.m. They woke everyone up and with an announcement that they were going to take the small children to a special kindergarten. I can never forget the memories of the mothers and fathers kneeling on their hands and knees, begging to save their children. Sure enough, 3 days later, the Germans returned with German shepherds. The dogs sniffed out the hidden children. The soldiers picked up the small ones and threw them against the wall of the building. They also threw some high up in the air for target practice. It is impossible to imagine the crying and the screaming of the parents. This was the end of Jewish children in the ghetto.
So this is where we lost the brother I never knew, Ephraim Ryback, under 2 years old. Shlomo was sent out of the ghetto on a forced work detail when word came that the Germans were preparing another action to slaughter the children. My mother, as a nurse, was forced to work for the Germans in the town jail. She had managed to smuggle morphine into the ghetto. Fearing that her baby would be tortured to death after what she saw, Chana and her sister Mirka put their children to sleep forever with morphine injections. Upon his return to the ghetto, Shlomo was bereft. and angry and didn't know what to do with himself. Chana's agonizing decision would torment their lives, even while rebuilding their family after the war. They never spoke about the story to me and my brother until 1990, when I began to document their stories. Most of the information was gathered from the few relatives who survived. So here you can see the picture. The families in the labor camp were kept together. Shlomo Rybak, Chana Rybak, and that is baby Rybak. I'm sorry, Lisa, were you saying something?
I was going to say that this is part of the museum now has preserved some of the barracks, so as they originally were. So this is when we went to the museum, we were just absolutely struck by the fact that these names were on part of the display.
However, I have since found out, and I'm still trying to verify, I believe that children were not, or young babies were not brought into the labor camp. It was only the workers. So I'm not sure why the name appears on the bunks. So that's the last little bit of research. And so few survivors that can tell me this story are available to give me testimony. So now we are going to go on to...
So just to I could just prepare the stage for the tunnel escape, which is what we're going to talk about now. So as you can hear, there was several successive slaughters where the original Jews from Novogrudok, and then also all of the people who'd been fleeing from other regions, which had poured into the regions. There were more than 11,000 Jews rounded up. At this point in May 1942, there were only 500 left, and they were put into the work ghetto after several massacres. On May 7th, 1943, the last Shrita happened. 260 workers were sent now to live in these workshops, and the rest were shot about 300 meters away. And it was at this point, after that last massacre, that the last people who were in there, these 260 people, recognized that there was no way they were going to survive this, and that they had to do the most desperate thing of all, which was make plans to escape. And that takes us to the tunnel portion here. And this is an image from the tunnel that has been excavated that's in the Museum of Jewish Resistance. So we know actually that of the 260 people that were left alive, 240 of them actually participated in the escape. Some of them were too frightened or for whatever reason chose not to go. Of those 240, 218 have now been identified by name, by survivors, by the museum, by the hard work of Tamara and the people she works with. Of the 218, of the 240 that actually survived, that escaped through the tunnel, 122 are known to have survived at very least until liberation in July 1944. 68 people died during the escape attempt at all, and the fate of 36 of them is unknown. And so this is actually the largest successful escape of Jewish prisoners in the Shoah. There are other examples of escapes such as Sobibor, but the number of people who actually survived this escape is the highest number that we've been able to identify. And so,
just to say one thing here.
Yeah.
This Dr. Betty Cohn, who lives in Israel, her mother, Fania Dunitz, worked with my mother in this lager. They were both nurses. She has undertaken to write a chapter of each of the 218 people. The book is currently in press, soon to be published. And there's a chapter in there about Chana and Shlomo Rybak. And I would love more people to know about that story.
So on the model here, you can see that the little yellow roofed buildings on the left, that's the barracks where they were kept. And you can actually see on the diagram where the tunnel happens in the upper left-hand corner. The tunnel itself came up out of, that was put underneath one of the beds to hide it. So just to tell you a little bit about the tunnel, because none of these people were engineers. It's really a remarkable act of desperation and just, putting together all of the best skills that they could. The tunnel itself is over 200 meters long, and the dimensions of the tunnel are 27 inches by 27 inches. And that when I looked at this, that's just an incredibly claustrophobic small space, especially after such a long area. So they had to crawl on their stomachs to get through. The tunnel itself was more than 1 meter under the ground. And digging it was this amazing act of engineering by people who were not actually engineers at all. They were slave laborers. They were starving. They were given just barely enough rations to stay alive. They would work all day, and then in shifts, they would stay up at night. They created tools in the workshops or stole things overnight, hid them on pain of death, of course, if they were discovered. And they began constructing the tunnel itself in May 1943. The escape happened in September 26th. And one of the things that we learned when they were there, the biggest problem with creating a tunnel is, what do you do with the dirt? The dirt was the biggest problem. So they took the 50 shortest men and they rotated them digging in pairs in 2-hour shifts. It was very, very humid in the tunnel, so they had to strip off as much of their clothes as possible. And then they had to figure out what to do with the dirt. They had sewed bags that they could use to carry it out. And they started to create false walls inside the barracks so that they could put the dirt in there. They added air shafts in there because when they tried to put lamps in, the lamps kept going out because there wasn't actually enough oxygen for the flames. So someone ingeniously came up with this cone construction that, which is a tiny little opening at the surface, but would bring air down so that it was possible to breathe in there. Someone tapped into an electrical line that the Nazis were using for their searchlights, and they put the entrance underneath a bunk bed. Now, they shored up the sides of the tunnel with planks from the bed so that it wouldn't collapse in on itself. And you have to understand the conditions in the barracks were so awful that the Nazis generally did not go in there. So they felt reasonably comfortable that it would never be discovered underneath the bed. They had to get special permission. They told the Nazis they needed a second latrine. And that was another way that they were able to hide some of the dirt, because the dirt was just this constant problem. They created this kind of track that would go through and built a little wheelbarrow structure that they could use to move the dirt out as the tunnel got longer and longer. Eventually, what we started to see was that they were able to pull this out. They were ready to do the first escape. Originally was planned in July, is one of the things that they were hoping to do. But they were going to come up in the middle of these very high wheat stalks, and that would help hide them as they came out of the tunnel. And then they would be able to make their way about 25 kilometers away to the Nalibaki forest, which is where they knew the partisans were. Now, the partisans had been sending messages, secret messages. There was people in the resistance to the prisoners in the ghetto saying, we're going to look for you, get out, we're going to be on patrol, we're going to bring you, you can come and join us and then live in the forest. And that was what gave them hope that once they escaped, there was actually somewhere that they would be able to do. They used kerosene lamps also to help dig all of these things. They just had to be as ingenious as possible to figure these things out. There was actually a man named Abraham Rakovsky, who, what he did, because he tapped into the electrical line for the Nazis, he engineered periodic brownouts and blinking lights for the searchlights so that the Nazis would generally get used to the idea that sometimes the electrical supply wasn't so good. And what happened in July is that they were supposed to go the next night and escape then, and disaster struck because the farmer plowed over the wheat field and harvested all the wheat. So they didn't have any cover anymore. So you can imagine how desperate and despondent they were. They went back to work and they had to extend the tunnel another 100 meters. So the original tunnel was half as long. They extended it into a cornfield, and they were able to then plan the escape for September 26th, when the corn stalks would be very high. The plan, Maya's going to tell you a little bit more about actually how the escape itself was engineered, but they had planned it for a moonless night when there wouldn't be as much light that they would be able to see them, and that the corn stalks would help hide them.
But sorry,
would you like to go? Okay. On the eve of the actual escape, everyone ended up receiving a piece of paper with the name of the person who they were supposed to follow. So if the Nazis did find out and they happened to catch someone, the whole group wouldn't have to be sacrificed. 2 people from the organizing committee were armed with pistols, and they stood at the entrance to the tunnel, and they watched the order and the sequence. And of course, they were also there for defense if the Nazis did end up coming. They had a small collection of weapons in the ghetto, and this was divided into two parts. So, of course, the first part was for those who were watching the entrance of the tunnel, and the second part was for those who went first into the tunnel. So if they were found out when they emerged into the field, they could defend themselves against the Nazis. I believe you have an anecdote, Bubby, about
the picture that you're seeing is a list with numbers of all the people who are going to be leaving and going out through the tunnel. The night before, they were given a piece of paper with a number, and the number indicated the person that would be in front of them in the line. They had everything timed down so that these people, the over 200 people that were going to go out, would be able to do the whole exercise in 48 minutes. So they had to be very organized. When it came the time for Hannah, my mother, to go down into the tunnel, she had a panic attack and said, no, she's not going down there. She won't be able to breathe. And she started having trouble breathing. She said she'd rather die. My father took pieces of rope that were lying around and some of the bags that they had used to take out the dirt, tied them together and tied it around her waist and his waist. And he literally dragged her through the tunnel. To, when she was here in Canada, I remember she had terrible fears about ever going down an escalator. And she always said, because it brought back memories of descending down into the dark tunnel.
So at 9 p.m. on the eve of the escape, the searchlight blinked several times and went out, and they knew that they had to start. Eventually, the guards did discover the escape, and as the last prisoners were crawling out of the tunnel, they ended up being shot on the spot. Baralyoslevich was a chief organizer of the tunnel project and of the escape, and he was killed near the village of Gorodechno the day after. He was only 39 years old at the time. When the people emerged from the tunnel, they all took off in different directions, because they knew if they all stayed together, then of course there would be a higher chance of getting caught. My great-grandparents ended up staying with a group of around 20 people. And they knew there were a number of Russian and even a few Jewish partisan groups that were based in the Luft and the Nalibuki forests, and they knew that somewhere in the woods they could find the Bielski partisan scouts who were looking for Jewish refugees. A few days later, they ended up tracking down a Polish farmer, Yarmolovich, who they had heard might be willing to help out Jews. When they broke into his house, he ended up taking them to his barn and granary, where it turned out he had been hiding other Jews. Upon leaving the ghetto, my great-grandfather's foot had been wounded, but instead of turning them away, Yarmolovich brought cotton and helped to clean and bind his wound. He even then brought the group a notably unkosher bucket of pork soup with lots of potatoes, onions, and lard, and although he had kept kosher his entire life, my great-grandfather would later describe it as the best soup he had ever had. However, the escapees couldn't stay. Yarmolovich had warned them that one of his own farmhands was spying for the Germans, and soon they might be discovered, so they would have to move on. He ended up pointing them in the general direction of Bielski Atrad and warned them that if they were to survive, they would have to know how to act like real partisans. So he led them to a house and he told them to raid for supplies, saying, "Go to the next farm tomorrow night and invade like real partisans." The small group set out, armed with carved wooden sticks that they were disguising as guns, and eventually another sympathetic Polish farmer directed them to an area where he knew that Jewish partisans would pass by. And early the next morning, they had heard a wagon full of Jewish partisans singing Russian and Jewish songs and knew that they had found the Bielski Atrad.
So before we move on to the section about the Bielski partisans, I'm going to show you a short video clip. This is from a film, a Belarusian film called L'chaim, where they dramatized the escape, what the tunnel escape actually might have been. It's just a short section. I'll show that to you in a moment. But I do think as we talk about these righteous Gentiles like Yarmolovsky and some of the others that were part of helping them, just to understand what the stakes were for helping any Jews in this area, if anyone was even suspected of helping or hiding Jews, they were shot, their whole family was shot, and then their farm and farm animals would be burnt to the ground. So the risks were very, very high for everybody who was there. So I'm just going to show you this very short video clip just so you can get a sense of what it might have been like for them. So I'm just going to move us on to the next section, just so that you can understand. And part of what they had to do when they got out of this tunnel, of course, was make their way in small groups, as Maya has described, to find their way to the forest. So this was territory that was controlled by the Germans, of course. They're small villages. It was hard to know who was friendly and who wasn't. They would be traveling by day, by night often. And they had to make their way about 20 kilometers to the forest. The Nalibaki forest is still this massive wilderness, often referred to as the lungs of Eastern Europe. And that is where the partisans were. And the partisans knew this was happening and they were looking out for them.
So as they climbed out of the tunnel, they tore off their yellow patches. And in that video clip, you saw those things, the yellow things that were on the ground. Many of them didn't even know where to run, but they knew that there would be safe houses and they knew that there would be partisans. They were brought to a small temporary infirmary once they were picked up by the Bielski scouts. And this infirmary had been set up to care for the ghetto escapees. They were worried that they would bring lice and typhus with them. It was an underground bunker called a zemlyanka, from the Russian word dugout. It was in the woods about 2 kilometers away from the main partisan camp. They stayed there in quarantine with a partisan named Wolf who cared for them for almost a week. When they recuperated and they were not in danger of making the other Bielski camp sick, Wolf took them to the camp. And that's where they were welcomed by this powerful, beautiful man astride a white horse with a gun. And the vision of a Jew with a gun on a white horse, dressed in a uniform, welcoming them was absolutely magical and breathtaking to these refugees. Alissa, you want to talk about this, or you want me to?
Well, you can talk about the three Bielski brothers here.
Okay, so here are the three Bielski brothers who were running the camps. They all had military experience before. They knew the woods intimately and were very well suited to organizing these unruly Jews. Could you imagine a group of, close to 1,000 Jews, all who wanted to do things their own way? So Tuvia was a genius as keeping order. Everything he said in a very calm and loving voice was listened to. The picture on top is Tuvia and his wife Lilka. She was his forest wife. They got married in the forest. Then there's Asiel and Chaya Bielski, and there's very interesting stories about them, and Zeus and Sonia Bielski. So, of course, Tuvia was played by Daniel Craig in the movie Defiance, and Liev Schreiber played the role of Zeus.
Now, the goal of the Bielski Brigade was really to save as many Jewish lives as possible. They were still a detachment of resistance fighters, but unlike most of the other partisan groups, they were willing to accept anyone: elderly people, non-fighters, women, children. All of that was fair game. And that was very different with the other partisan groups. Generally would only accept armed young men. You had to have a gun, you had to be young, you had to be a man. And in fact, the others, the Russian ones, weren't always so happy to accept Jews at all. So this really did make this quite exceptional in that way. Now, just to give you a sense of where this is, the Nalibaki Forest off to the right here, Novogrudok is the town over there. The little village of Stankiewicz is where the Bielskis were from. They were a very large family of many kids. There were a couple of other Jewish families, the Chinchelskis, the Bordeaux, that were in that area. The Bielski family, they knew the backwoods. They had been in the forest, but they also, were running vodka and running things through the back forest. When the Nazis came in, their parents said to them, "You boys, you know the woods. Get out there and see what you can do to save the Jews." And of course, the Bielski parents were shot by the Nazis and didn't survive the war. This is there were a couple of different camps that the Bielskis were in. When my grandparents joined in 1943, this was the final camp, what they called the Forest Jerusalem, and it was the biggest one by far. The other camps had been discovered by the Nazis, or threatened to be discovered over time, and they would disperse and then have to find a new place. But this bit was the one they were in the longest, and it was the biggest by far. So as you can see from the map, there is a main street, there was health clinics, there was a place where they were making soap, and a bakery, there was a bathhouse, a synagogue. They had all kinds of different workshops, and they had Zemlyankas, the dugouts where the families would be allocated to live in. And it literally became a thriving town of over 1,200 people that was in there. It really is quite remarkable. I'll let Maya speak to this a little bit. She has some interesting descriptions.
Yeah, so as Nolan was saying, it really became quite like its own thriving little town. There was, of course, the main street you can see there in the center. Every hut has its own number and like a nickname depending on the origin of the occupiers or their trade. So for example, there was hut number 11, which was called Intelligentsia, because the camp doctor Hirsch and a woman dentist from Pinsk and a lawyer Volkovsky from Baranovich and a few other professional people lived there. And the main street was really a major traffic route. It was alive with all sorts of people, things going on. People strolled around in their typical uniforms. This was generally peasant garb, also military, and a strange combination of peasant furs. They wore army caps, both Russian and German or peasant fur caps, and friends gathered in the main street, as did groups of guests who visited the camp. There were a total of 27 doctors and a staff of nurses in the hospital and the infection ward for patients with typhoid. Of course, typhoid was a major danger at the time. In a huge room in the center of the camp, workshops were located where 18 tailors altered and repaired clothes and sewed underwear from linen. There were 20 shoemakers who repaired and sewed shoes. Saddlers made saddles and belts, and joiners made windows and the butts for rifles. And blacksmiths shod horses and made parts or repairs of weapons. And they sewed hats in the hat shop and ground flour at the mill for bakery, where they baked several sorts of bread. They had a sausage shop and made sausage and smoked meats. There was even a hairdresser, a watch workshop, and a school, and as my mom said, a bathhouse and a soap factory. So it was really, really like its own self-sustaining little town. There was a brigade of women who washed for the entire detachment. In the common kitchen, they cooked soup for everybody. And Sylvia had personally made sure that every few days, children received milk. And the rest filled in by guarding the camp or collecting and repairing firewood. So my great-grandmother, Hannah, she worked with Dr. Hirsch in the infirmary, and my great-grandfather, Shlomo, taught in the school, and he also drove the ambulance wagon.
So just this is an image of the main street now as it exists. The Bielski camp that we're talking about, this Forest Jerusalem, is now an archaeological site. And we were there in 1944 for the reunion. We actually were standing there July 8th. 2019 was exactly 75 years to the day that the camp was liberated as the Soviets made their way west. So there's, as I said, an archaeological site, and there's examples of the dugouts there, and various artifacts are still found. The very early days when the Bielskis took to the woods, this is from their family, and they were gathering people around them, and the group was getting bigger, learning how to live in the forests. Just a few images of some other partisans over time, some people of all ages. Is an example of the Zemlyanka, what a dugout looked like. They actually were pretty warm in the winter and nice and cool in the summer. As you can see, the inside isn't as rough as you might actually imagine. They were able to live relatively comfortably. Another example of a Zemlyanka. So when we went back, we were there with some of the other descendants. There were over a couple hundred people from all over the world, and people were telling stories. That you could see there were mushrooms in the woods. This was a pretty swampy place. The mosquitoes were pretty intense, and you can imagine what spending a winter in a freezing Russian forest might have been like. The museum has been collecting and labeling artifacts of different kind as well, so that those actually are being preserved. Now, this is just an interesting story that I think actually is worth telling. There's a woman named Lola. She was 6 months old when she's one of the Bielski cousins. It's a very large family. I think they had 13 children in all. She was a baby at the time. And although the Bielskis allowed children in the camps, they couldn't have babies and very, very small children, because obviously they couldn't keep quiet, and they risked giving away their position, and the lives of everyone was there. So in the forest, she's telling us this story about how what they did was they would go into the towns where the Bielskis had good relations with the Poles and Tatars and the people who lived in the surrounding villages. And they engineered this way, they put a baby in a basket on a doorstep, and the family would come out and go, oh, look, a baby on the doorstep. And then they had paid off the chief of police in the town. The chief of police would come and investigate. Don't worry, it's not a Jewish child. Of course, it's a girl child, so it makes it a little bit easier. And so she was then taken in by this family in the village, and they kept her as if they were going to adopt her as their own to keep her safe during the war. Now, what happens with Lola at the end of the war is that her family, after they were liberated, went to get her, and the family did not want to give her up. She was now one of their own. She said she has, very vague memories, but very warm ones. She was treated very well and cared for very well. And so what the Bielskis did was they waited until the middle of the night, and then they broke in and kidnapped their own child back so that they could keep her with them. Now, she also told this really remarkable story of another one of her cousins who was at that point a little bit under 2 years old. And the problem with a 2-year-old is she was still too little to be able to be kept in the camp because she couldn't reliably keep quiet. But they, of course, wanted to find a place to place her. Now, unlike Lola at 6 months old, at 2 years old, she was speaking fluent Yiddish, and she was therefore a huge risk to any family that took her in. So this family, you can see this is actually an image of this other cousin who went back in the 1990s to visit. She asked that we blur her face because she just didn't feel comfortable with her identity shared. This is actually the house that she went back to. And what they did was they took her into a potato cellar. And this is the image of her with another cousin. That potato cellar is still there. They kept her in there for 6 months until she forgot how to speak Yiddish and learned how to speak fluent Polish. And she recounts that when she went back in the 1990s and they ripped up the floorboards, the smell of potatoes was so overwhelming that she had this like a panic attack, like that smell of potatoes in a cellar. Too young to have any real memories, but obviously her body still remembered this. They kept her alive is really the most remarkable thing. So that is really something. Another remarkable story, as we've been telling this presentation, we've been meeting more and more people and connecting with people online. This is a family that made their way into the Bielski partisans, but they didn't escape during the tunnel escape. They managed to escape the ghetto earlier, and they were making their way over to the forest. And at one point, a non-Jewish family, agreed to take them in. And they spent one night with that family. And the next morning, they left and they made their way over to the forest. Unfortunately, one of the Jewish people and I guess it's the great grandparents of the person who shared this with me, forgot their dentures in a glass. And the next day, they never knew this. They made their way. When they went back in the 1990s, they met this woman, had been one of the children of that family that protected them in that same house. And the woman told them, she welcomed them very warmly. But she told them the next day the Nazis had come and discovered the dentures and said only rich Jews can afford dentures, and shot their parents on sight. So they never knew the cost that family had paid to keep them alive. The woman welcomed them very warmly and at really quite an amazing moment. So, Mom, I'm going to let you tell a little bit more, if you want, about the Bielskis before we go on and talk about the reunion. I know you have some other notes.
Yeah. Well, we went through a variety of different things. I just wanted to say that while they were in the camp, this Bielski camp was very famous among the other Russian partisan groups that were in the forest. And they would come to the Bielski camp for medical services, to have their horses reshod, to have their guns fixed, and always in exchange for food. That was the secret to why there were so many trades and why the camp was able to survive as a little community, supplying the needs of so many people. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they didn't allow pregnancies they couldn't stop the pregnancies, but there was a big a rush of abortions that had to take place so that the camp would remain safe. And of course, we all know about the huge baby boom that happened among survivors after they left the forest. Before we, Maya, do you want to talk about what the Bielskis accomplished as in terms of resistance, and then we'll talk about when they left the camp?
Sure. So in addition to saving Jewish lives, the Bielski Brigade also actively fought the Nazis by mainly tampering and destroying their equipment. So in total, they managed to blow up 6 trains, 1 railway bridge, 18 bridges on the highway, 16 cars, and 800 meters of railway track. They destroyed 9 kilometers of telegraph and telephone communications, 1 sawmill, and they burned 8 estates. They engaged in 12 different battles and ambushes, and in total killed 261 enemies, German officers, soldiers, and policemen. Over the course of the war, Bielski Trad lost around 50 people, with the last 7 tragically dying on the dawn of July 9, 1944, when retreating Germans happened to stumble upon their camp. On July 10, 1944, they left the camp in the Naliboki forest, and they headed for Novogrodok, where Tuvia officially dismissed the detachments on the outskirts of the town. 2 years later, in the book Forest Jews, which was based on interviews with Tuvia, Zeus, and Sonia Bielski, Tuvia Bielski gave the total number of the detachment personnel as 1,230 people.
So we have here just some images from the reunion in 2019. This is my mom and myself and 2 of my cousins, my uncle Jaime, my cousins Andrea and Lauren. It was actually this really moving, joyous occasion. We were a couple hundred people from all over the world speaking so many different languages. Someone pulled out a fiddle, and for the first time in 75 years, we had Jews dancing the hora in this section of the forest. We walked around, visited scenes, the different dugouts. This is us with our cousins, the Kushners, in one area. People were still finding artifacts as we moved through the space. One of our friends that we met there, Simon Wolf from Toronto, his grandfather was one of the 7 people who were killed on the day of liberation when the Nazis, as they were retreating from the Soviets, stumbled across the camp, as Maya said. There had never been a funeral for these people in the chaos of liberation. So we said Kiddush while we were there and memorialized them. So that was an image that he had. We were treated by the little town of Naliboki to a partisan lunch. There were many shots of vodka, including with some of the mayor and the townspeople. This is an image of my uncle and my mom with Aaron Bielski, who was the only surviving Bielski brother. He was, I think, 12 or 13 when the war broke out in that section, and yet has amazing stories of things that he was doing to be part of what his brothers were involved in. We felt very fortunate that he was there with us. He was 93 and he continues, he's still alive. He's doing great. He joins us for partisan Zoom meetings and things like that from time to time as well. And of course, we lit candles for the memorial wall, which was unveiled at that time. I am going to just show a very short video here. One of the most remarkable things that happened when we were in the forest is that the granddaughter-in-law of Asaela, who is the daughter of Asael. Asael was killed at the very end. He's one of the Bielski brothers, but Asa and his wife was pregnant with Asaela, who he never got to meet. Her granddaughter-in-law is a concert violinist with the University of Istanbul Orchestra, and she brought her violin into the forest and wandered off with some of the family members. Their family is part of the Violins of Hope project, where they are collecting musical instruments from Jewish ghettos, concentration camps, labor camps all over as part of this project. And she played this impromptu performance of Avinu Malkeinu that was just incredibly moving for those of us who were around. So with your permission, I'm going to just show you a very short clip of this. So just a few words as we end here today, just to tell you, the kind of epilogue here, and I'll pass this over to you, Mum, to just tell the story of what happened to the Bielskis and descendants in our family when the war ended.
So after the war, the group returned to Novogrudek. They marched from a line that was 2 kilometers long all the way to the town. They were now in Stalin's Russia, and they didn't receive a warm welcome from the neighbors who had moved into their homes. They were conscripted by the Soviets to work for them, and my parents got false papers and somehow managed to leave with the support of the Joint Distribution and the Bricha. And they made their way to a DP camp. And here are my parents with their twin babies, my brother and I, in Castel Gandolfo. And it was an amazing blessing that they had 2 children, and never mentioned to us, but it was always in their hearts, about the baby Ephraim who was missing. If you'll go on to the next picture, I'm so conscious about the time, Alissa. Here are emergency identity certificate papers. As we were leaving the DP camp, we were supposed to first go to Israel. My mother at the last moment dug in her heels and said, no, she can't go to another country that is still fighting for survival. So we found a sponsor to bring us to Canada. Here's a picture of Jaime and I in the front row in the DP camp. Next, this is an iconic picture of the bar mitzvah. My brother and I are in the middle. I don't know if you can get into Ray Kushner. Can you zero in on her? Next to my mother in the middle is Ray Kushner, whose story was the story you heard about the blood on the stones. Behind her, the man to her right is her husband. They are the grandparents of Jared Kushner, the great-grandparents of Jared Kushner. All the people in this picture are survivors who are relatives and survivors who lived. Tuvia Bielski is not in the picture because he was not a blood relative, but he was definitely there. And here's a picture of the parents who are toasting Jaime's bar mitzvah. This is a scant 9 years after arriving in Canada. Unbelievable that we're able to get this together to be able to do that. This on the left is the only surviving sibling of both my parents' families, my uncle Leibke, Leon Ryback. Some of you may have known him as a gym teacher at Shar Zion and the Dath Israel. And the other couple are Celia and Isidore Ryback, who sponsored us to come to Canada. My father's only distant living relative who was able to find us. There's a picture of Tuvia right in the middle in the front row. At his 85th birthday, survivors from all over gathered to feed him. And my parents Dad is in the back row with the glasses, and my mother is just below with the glasses. Yeah. Do we have another picture? Oh, here's an iconic picture. Those of you at Shar Shamayim who went to Herzliya, Talmud Torah, will recognize many of the people in this picture. Top middle row is my dad. Many of the Hebrew teachers who were there were actually survivors of the camps. Just 2 people to the left of him, 3, is Mr. Meldung, who taught us in Herzliya. Many of you will recognize these faces. If you can do a blow up, or I can send it to Mark and share it with those of you that would like to see it. So they built a very wonderful and full life in Canada. And here's a picture of all of their great-grandchildren, the 2 people who lost everything in their lives, lost a child, survived by climbing through a tunnel into an unknown future, lived in the forest, made their way to a country and rebuilt their lives. They're truly a memorial to resilience.
I'll just speak briefly about, if that's okay, Mum, just about
one thing, that there are a couple of documentaries that exist that document the tunnel. The Tunnel of Hope with Michael Kagan and Dror Schwartz. Tamara was the consultant. The Book of Curses is another documentary by Michael Kagan and Tamara. And in press is The People of the Tunnel, the book I referred to by Betty Cohn of Jerusalem. The model of the Novogrudok labor camp and the tunnel for children to crawl through, the model of it exists in the Imperial Museum in London. So if you're ever there, it might be something you want to look for. Alissa?
It's just worth saying that nobody knew this story until the Soviet Union fell in the 1990s. This is Jack Kagan. He was one of the youngest survivors, and he made his way back. He was in the UK, made his way back. He was a documentarist, interest in history, and he made his way back to Novogrudok and went into the Historical Society, where Tamara Vershitskaya was then the director, and said, I want to find the tunnel. And she said, what tunnel? So all of this had just, as the Soviets re-engineered the telling of what they call the Great Patriotic War, there was no space for telling the story of the Jews that had lived in that area, of the ghetto, of the tunnel. None of that was there. And he really was very passionate about doing that. He was actually later decorated by the Belarusian government for his part in helping to commemorate that. This is Tamara on the left. Standing with the mayor of Nalaboki. They're welcoming us as descendants in 2019 as we're visiting all of these different sites. And she's really made it her life's work to put the museum together, create these books and documentaries. This memorial wall that we described at the beginning with the names of all the escapees was one of the things they unveiled when we were there in 2019. This is a site in Minsk. There is, of course, death around every corner if you care to look for it in this part of the world. This is a place of mass graves, but there isn't actually that much told about it. In Minsk itself, this is a site of a mass grave and a killing pit, and actually a sculpture by an Israeli artist of people coming down there is remarkable because it's quite unusual. So when Jack Kagan went back and started working with Tamara, they brought a documentary crew and they went and started excavating the tunnel, and they created a documentary around this. So really this remarkable moment where this piece of history that would have been lost or just was kept in the memories of those who had managed to escape suddenly became a really important story to tell. Now, the 2008 film Defiance and the book by Nechama Tech, of course, that predated and which the film is based on, tells the story of the partisans, not the escape. Really, the plot points are right on there. My grandparents told us many of these stories, and we know that they did research it and consulted with the Bielskis and with survivors when they put it together. The thing about resistance is really an interesting part of Holocaust education that I was never taught as a child. And I think these are really important stories to share. We know that there were over 30,000 documented Jewish resistors during the Shoah. There are doubtless countless more, but those are stories that may never be told as the survivors are passing on. So it is so important that we continue to tell these stories and to share them with people. When we first put this presentation together last year, one of the surviving partisans, Leah Bitzowski Johnson, had just passed away, and we wanted to commemorate that she had lived this long life, amazing life, and so many fantastic stories, and that the Bielskis and the people around them were part of the reason that was able to happen. We're going to end here with a clip that is of children from around Eastern Europe singing Kol mit Zeigmol, that you probably know, the partisan song. This is part of a project where they're teaching this to children all over the world and then editing video clips of the children singing it together. So I'm going to just end with this here. Feel free to sing along, and then I think Mark's going to come back just to close things off for us.
Святе blaue Land des weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Bein, mit unser Weg. Und wie gewohnt sie spritzt von unser Blut. Spritzen, wenn dort unser Glore, unser Boot. Und wie kommen, wenn dort unser ausgedehnte Schau. Selber warten unser Traum, wir seinen Lohn.
So wie Demos, du gehst den besten Weg. Musimy daje waszego enem. Jeśli mnie rozwita nasz bój, полетит потоком песня как порой. Jeśli mnie rozwita nasz bój, полетит потоком песня как порой.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We thank you all so much. Thanks to the Shar Hashemayim Synagogue for inviting us to speak with you in this Tuesday Night Learning series. I think I speak for all three of us when we say how much of a privilege it is to be able to continue to tell this story.
Sylvia, Alissa, Maya, thank you for this very exceptional presentation, heart-wrenching and delightful at the same time. It was exciting to see 3 generations of your family tied together by this important history. I asked Sylvia why she produced this exceptional presentation. She said, "My children were exposed to this history directly and impacted by it. Their grandparents, but to their children, the Holocaust and this family history is just another event similar to the destruction of the temple or the story of Queen Esther. I wanted to construct emotional ties to this event, and I'll tell you, you were very successful." On another note, when you showed that picture of Talmud Torah teachers, it stirred my memory. Mar Reback, your father and grandfather and great-father was my teacher, and I was in the same class as your brother, Jaime. And we didn't understand what was going on or what happened or the history of him and other teachers that were teaching us who came from Europe. We were too busy making trouble. It's wonderful that you are preserving this history for your children and for our community. It is a true statement of resistance and a great lesson for all of our people. So I just want to thank you once again. It was really fantastic. I would also like to thank Susan Greenspoon and Robin Bennett for their excellent technical know-how to put this thing together. And I can tell you, it is much appreciated. There are no glitches. It added so much to the presentation. Next week, Morris Goodman, a prominent businessman, philanthropist, and Shar member, will be seen in conversation with his children. Don't miss this exciting presentation next week. And thanks everybody for attending. Really appreciate it. And it was a wonderful night. Thank you.